there's a need for entrepreneurs more than anything, right? And I think that there's never been a better time in speaking for the U.S. There's a more supportive venture angel investing educational ecosystem than there's ever been before to get people who have extraordinary ideas related to climate technology to a point where they can be impactful.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CleanTechies Podcast. This is episode 61 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to bring the show to you and super thankful again to you for tuning in. If this is your first time with us, please do subscribe and turn on notifications to join us on this journey as we share the stories and technology of the future in helping solve climate change. If you are a returning listener, please give us a review as it really helps us to get in front of new listeners on the various platforms. And of course, also we want to highlight if you are a founder in the space, feel free to reach out. If you're looking to get into the world, we'd love to learn about your company. Perhaps you're seeking funding or talent. Any introductions that we can make, we are glad to do so. So please reach out for those. And then I guess with that, let's get into the details of today's episode. Today we are speaking with Nicholaus Rohleder. Nick does a lot of different things, but some of the main things he does, which we kind of talk about, are his work teaching at Columbia and then running a Climate Commodities, kind of a climate trading and logistics company. And our conversation was one of my favorite conversations since it was very high level and tackled many macro problems that I really like diving into. And these things include anything from geopolitics to kind of the de-globalization / globalization topic. We talked about mining, mineral availability, some of the unique problems faced by climate tech companies building hardware solutions in particular, which has always been kind of a core theme I like to talk on. So it's a really, really great conversation. Really enjoyed what Nick had to say. Very knowledgeable about many, many things in the space. So super thankful to him for coming on the show and extremely excited to share this with you. As always, before we get into the show, we want to make thanks to our sponsors, Next Wave Partners. Next Wave Partners are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you perhaps are looking to make your own career change, you can reach out to Next Wave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. So without any further delay, let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the show, Nick. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm great. It's a beautiful day in New York. Obviously, you're quite familiar with New York, so you know when it's a nice day. It's a nice day for sure, right?
Absolutely. I'm in Dallas, Texas, so I envy you.
Yeah, it's not as hot probably. It's getting to that time of year where it's nice. You can wear nice fashion, coats and stuff. But anyways, I appreciate you coming on, Nick. Obviously, we've been in touch for a bit here, but I'm very keen to have you on the show. So for everybody listening, why don't you give us a quick introduction to yourself and kind of the key areas that you're working on? I know you have a lot of things. Let's kind of talk on the key areas that you're working on.
Yeah, again, thank you for having me. And I'll walk through my background and then Climate Commodities, my company as well. Personally, originally from Oklahoma, grew up in a family that's been in the oil and gas industry for about 70 years in that part of the country. As a kid, learned the business working for a family operating company in the field. So just about every job, manual labor job you can think of that you don't want to do. Ended up going to school for alternative energy technology, first at Columbia, then at Penn. Ended up in the alternative investment management space, specific to what at the time was called transition industries, is now broadly constituted as ESG. Insert your sustainability criteria or verbiage there. Started with my partner, Ben Banmort. I was formerly a portfolio manager at Millennium Management, and then Castleton Commodities, which is Louis Dreyfus Energy, Climate Commodities about 3 years ago. So Climate Commodities does a number of things, but our flagship platform is our commodity merchanting business, which encompasses effectively three things: physical trading, specialty and supply chain financing, and insurance. So the way that we think about this climate ecosystem, especially coming from Ben and myself and a lot of our staff, engineering backgrounds, oil and gas space, chemicals, thinking about to get from where we are now to meet stated climate targets, there are capital gaps and there are service gaps. and what are the critical capital and service gaps that with our background, really in credit and commodities, that we're positioned to fulfill. So those three verticals, trading, insurance, specialty finance, if you're in the climate tech ecosystem, usually to get your project over the line, there's an abundance of capital, but there's not an abundance of sophisticated risk mechanisms to package that into a box that gets a capital provider comfortable. So what we effectively do is, on the one hand, you need an intake contract and an offtake contract. And what our physical trading business does is focuses on opening up new markets in the reason our business is called Climate Commodities, for climate positive output coming from these technologies that's going to be beneficial to the next generation of materials. So what we effectively do is take our backgrounds, institutionally trading some of these materials, and apply it to the new energy ecosystem, which we believe over the last 10 to 15 years, it's fair to say that commodities have sucked broadly. A lot of our former colleagues that were in this space, transition industries, really got out of the business at a time when we were hitting an infrastructure investment super cycle that is going to spill over directly into a commodity super cycle. So we believe that we're well positioned there. In addition to that, the second leg of the stool is the insurance side. So if you sit in front of a capital provider and you've got a first of its kind, second of its kind technology going into the field that's going to be quite impactful, the ability to have technology performance insurance to, one, comfortability for capital providers, and two, comfortability for customers that your product is going to work. It's exceptionally important to really meet a service gap that effectuates a transfer of risk from capital markets to insurance markets. And we believe this is in the first inning, and we've created an impactful solution that's highly synergistic with our physical trading business. The third leg of the stool is supply chain and specialty financing. So the way we think about this, overlaying physical trading, really overlaying physical trading as the core business than insurance, is in most cases, a lot of these corporates in the climate tech ecosystem, whether it's raw material suppliers, whether it's vanilla manufacturers, especially if they're an SME, they're taking on capital investment. They have levels of capital investment that they haven't had to do in the past. And they're increasing the complexity of their capital structure, which necessitates more creative and specialty finance and solutions to allow them to optimize working capital, run their business efficiently, and really fulfill their mission, right? So a good example of that is if you just look at the supply chain bottlenecks in the world today, buy now, pay later programs in the climate tech value chain are exceptionally value added to customers that, despite the what some people believe to be negative broad economic backdrop, the tailwinds in climate technology are quite considerable. So you have, effectively this policy-driven counter-cyclical trade where these companies are investing into a downturn and requiring an increasingly specialized support in their procurement and financing programs off balance sheet to meet their targets. And that's where we come in. So we look at the Climate Commodities platform is we sell all three of these things, separate businesses rolled up under one holding company that has a digital platform that you can transact on. So we look at our business as a digitized risk solution in a box for the climate technology ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And last thing on myself, in addition to that, I teach the life cycle assessment course as an adjunct professor at Columbia's climate school.
Okay, interesting. So I guess there's a lot of things to break down here. One thing it'd be helpful, I think, for people who are maybe less familiar with the space, is there possible that we could give kind of an example of one specific type of business that might kind of use these three services, that you could help us walk through that example and point out in this type of business, something that people are familiar with and they understand roughly where those three things come in?
Yeah, I'll give you a handful of examples in each area, right? Let's say, for example, you are in physical trading, right? Let's say you're putting together a waste energy project, right? Like both sides of that coin, right? Let's say you're taking a municipal solid waste or a like kind product, and then you're spitting out some sort of carbonaceous output that serves as an industrial decarbonization input, right? So on the front end of that contract, the typical way that the waste space works is that you get paid, you receive payment to accept the waste, right? So that being said, is you may have, unless you're dealing with waste management or public services, you may have 10 to 15 different suppliers, right? So the difference between a project developer going out there and trying to facilitate that themselves with no esoteric commodities trading experience is that we can, on an integrated basis, manage the aggregation of 10 to 15 suppliers, packaging into one counterparty, and handle the transportation just accordingly. So what the project developer sees in the front end is a long-term contract manufactured by a principal trader like ourselves. It's also handling the corresponding logistics, QA, QC, and walking through that hand in hand with the development company or associated project counterparty. On the other side of that, on the offtake side, similar function, right? Depending upon the output, it's unlikely, and most developers do not want to sell all product to one counterparty, especially if it's a sizable project. So again, packaging in a principal trading capacity, an esoteric commodity solution into that end market. So effectively, what we do on the physical trading side is if you have a project, input, output, we manufacture a fixed margin by sophisticated contracting on either side of the system. Stepping into the next leg of this, if we interact with a corporate or a developer at the point of, let's say, breaking ground or at an earlier stage, we can also use our specialty in supply chain financing business to sit in the procurement financing value chain and interface with vendors, EPCs, and really de-risk a lot of that process and limit working capital drain on the front end. In a similar fashion, right? Where let's say, for example, just taking a like kind easier to without using a really specific component. Let's say, for example, you're a solar panel manufacturer and you buy polysilicon on a fixed cadence, right? What we would do is plug into that program, pay that supplier day one, and you pay us 90 days when it hits your factory floor. So that working capital optimization is especially important. And if you look at right now, amplifying that with the policy backdrop, the manufacturing push in the United States is necessitating more capital spend, which the more efficient your supply chain financing programs are, the better your position to make those large capital investments. So shifting back to the waste energy project on the insurance side, that space, it's fair to say, is in its early days. There are a lot of projects in the field, but the type of intake feedstock changes by jurisdiction and really changes a lot by jurisdiction fundamentally. So the idea there is that the technology solution, right? It sounds great. You have two, intake contract, offtake contract. You get paid to take the product, but the real risk is in the black box, the technology that converts that. So, outside of sophisticated contracting and a well-defined supply chain financing program, what's really going to get a capital provider comfortable, or a customer, right, that says, hey, there's host risk there too. If you're an industrial, let's say, just insert your manufacturer here, and you're going to introduce new product into your system, you need to understand QA, QC, when that's hitting your floor, if there's downtime, how that's going to be structured. And what comes in quite nicely on the capital side and on the customer side is a technology performance insurance solution that provides that backstop. So that's really, if you think about how our platform can interact with someone in the climate tech ecosystem, that's exactly it, all three legs of the stool. The other side of it, on a limited basis, we do have operating businesses that we are either the minority or majority shareholder in renewable power, mineral processing and refining, and transportation and logistics that can slide in there too, depending upon the circumstance or situation.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, this is a very needed item for companies in the emerging space because of the maybe difficulties surrounding it, and especially on the insurance side. So I guess with that said, I'm keen to understand how did you ultimately decide to get into the climate space, coming from kind of a background of oil and gas, and like what led you to that side of things?
It's interesting. There are a myriad of things. I have two distinct experiences that led me into this space. One, working in the field when I was younger, there's extraordinary opportunity for people entering the traditional energy ecosystem that are not, if you work hard, you'll be rewarded working in a manual labor capacity there, and you get paid in excess a lot more than you would in any other career. The downside of that is that there is significant environmental damage that is dealt by that industry, and really working in an extractive industry in a manual labor capacity, it's more on display than arguably anything else. And I experienced that when I was a kid. And I really thought similarly. I lived with my grandparents growing up. My grandfather was one of the gentlemen who started a family business in that area. Really impressionable on me and talking about, the next, you're younger, the next 50 years, the next 60 years. And despite, being an oil and gas corporate, it's like, this is going to change. And if you want to be on the right side of this, you need to shape your educational experience to suit that, because you will always have this experience in the field. So that led me to, do my educational background. And I had a professor when I was a student at Penn that really shaped my idea on this. It was interesting. This really led me into the commodity space. Is thinking about. I never thought about this, right? But thinking about in general, there's two things going on right now. We have an exploding population, until very recently, an expanding global economy, and ever increasing consumption. In that case alone, notwithstanding sustainability, if you take any basic commodity, oil, gas, everything that's allowing us to communicate here today, and you were to throw out the bank projection and take that commodity, index it to consumption, to world population growth, and then add a supplementary variable and say, how many people in the developing world are driving cars, consuming like we do in the West, eating meat? If you think about that, you start to run out on a 40, 50, 60, 70-year time horizon, which, when I was learning about this, is well within my life expectancy, God willing. I started to really think about that. I was like, there's two things going on. There's a sustenance of life and the materials requirement for that. And there's an extraordinary energy transition that is likely to occur that's going to put stress on traditionally industrial minerals and materials, completely reshape the ecosystem. So I looked at it, I was like, how do you, there's not very much professional development opportunity in that space. And I looked at it, I was like, I can teach myself some of this, and I can get into a role that's differentiated where, I have some of this experience. And I do believe that, leading to where we are right now with climate commodities, till I got into this space, I do believe that some of the most extraordinary opportunities that will emerge from solving the climate crisis are the materials evolution and alteration that go into, one, sustaining life, and two, supporting some of these climate technologies. Because if you look at the long term, we're going to run out of just about everything. So the two key things that I think that is a long-term vision of climate commodities is enabling new markets for substitute materials, and on a supplementary basis, really understanding end-to-end circularity, because that is the only supplementary variable that bolsters resource consumption over the long term and makes it more sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I guess there's a couple things we could pull on there. Maybe the first thing, since you mentioned it last and it's most fresh in what we just talked about, is the running out of materials thing. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about mining in general and kind of your familiarity there, and various, I guess, expectations on what kind of minerals we have left. Are there certainties that we know about? Hey, these are going to be limited, and you maybe talk about more of what's going to have to happen in order to change that, as you were mentioning about the circular economy.
Well, so there's a couple of things here, and I think that talking about the mining ecosystem as it relates to the energy transition, really in two parts. The main right now, if you separate that industry into electrons and molecules, with the electron/electrification side, grid electrification, vehicle electrification being the core constituent and what's growing the fastest, with secondarily the alternative fuels molecule side growing a little bit slower, being in an earlier stage. Taking electrification side, you look at the base commodities. You've got lithium, cobalt, graphite, rare earths, and a myriad of others, right? And the situation that we have right now is that these are all mined and processed through proven technologies, right? There are technology advances that are coming down the pipe, but the base consideration here, and any point when you think about comparing it to the oil and gas industry, right? It's quite strange how the availability of critical materials or commodities is directly linked to directly correlated to one, the price, and two, the amount of geological professionals dedicated to estimating reserves. So at this juncture, it's quite interesting, because a lot of these products are basically industrial minerals that are now, well, all those except rare earths, right? industrial minerals that are now required for one of the fastest growing areas of the economy. So, right now, what's limiting the space and where we have a problem as far as running out of materials, right? If you look at in general, we get to a point where the mining industry is not an unloved space, and this is a major recipient of capital investment, and it's brought into the same levels the oil and gas industry, which it's going to have to be, right? I think that in the near term, the availability challenge is not a resource availability, it's a resource utilization and implementation of mining programs. So the problem we have right now, if you look at discovery to production, especially you're looking at 10 plus years in a lot of these verticals. And a big chunk of that is tied to government permitting. The policy support mechanism to allow hosting is arguably the most important things. That's the biggest pushback. And you look at some of the corporates out there right now that have really struggled with this. There's a series of plays. U.S., North Carolina delayed over permitting issues. Actually in Europe, there's considerable reserves available in Serbia. Similarly, ran into political issues. So you look at the resource need in the near term relative to meeting stated climate targets, and these policy issues with siting and permitting have to be unwound. That's the biggest bottleneck to this right now. And I think the next iteration of this, as we get into at scale production, notwithstanding geopolitical tensions, the geological ecosystem, just like oil and gas, will evolve dramatically. If you look historically, how many times we're going to run out of oil. We've gone to the ends of the earth, with horizontal drilling offshore, right? Like it's quite interesting that when you really think, and coming from my background, coming from the oil and gas space, similar extractive vertical, and growing up in a family that also had a mining business. I think my view on this is a little bit jaded relative to others. I do think that if this becomes critical and not a supplement to the economy, like right now we're learning the criticality of the oil and gas sector, right? The situation in Ukraine, underinvestment in fossil fuels. And if you get to this point with the new energy ecosystem, you will start to see that we'll go to the ends of the earth to find these materials if they support the critical backbone of the global economy. And so, I think the main takeaway here is that and we can talk a little bit about geopolitics here and how this relates to this, because the biggest first hiccup is permitting, right? In the near term, if there was more coordination on the policy side, we could condense timelines to get mining projects in service quite considerably. The technology and the manpower is there. I think that the shifting gears a little bit, there is a geopolitical issue in this space. As most people have read, the Chinese have monopolized what would be considered, if you look at in oil and gas terms, the midstream and downstream sections of the value chain. So transportation, refining, processing, refining, distribution. So the issue right now, if you look at the United States, right, and take some of the corporates that are out there today, is that even if they can get an extractive project off the ground, the next step is processing, refining, distribution, finding an end market for that. And the processing and refining capacity exists almost exclusively in China. And in addition to that, if you look at going back to getting a bank comfortable with a project or a capital partner, if the Chinese in some of these cases control 70, 80% plus of the capacity, you're going to be inherently using Chinese technology and Chinese process technology transfer, which I think the biggest thing that in this geopolitical spat that is overlooked, that really is going to be a challenge in this space, is there's technology transfer and there's process knowledge transfer. And at one point in time, the United States and the Western world had both on the mining side, and still do to a relative degree. The issue is that as the Chinese have risen in prominence, there are some nefarious tactics that they've employed to subsidize these industries. Well, subsidize jurisdictional production that then is dumping into global markets, that is now on display. But in addition to that, they've built up the process knowledge, which is what's going to have to be exported, and there's going to have to be some sort of collaboration there on a go-forward basis. Right now, we just got IRA passed. There's a lot of speculation as to what's going to happen in the United States, but really thinking about implementation and meeting climate targets, which, hopefully we have some sort of climate diplomacy for it, so we can cooperate on this. There's going to have to be reverse process knowledge transfer from China into the Western world.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, given the circumstances, especially with the energy crisis globally and things of that nature, that the mentality in the US will shift away from kind of preventing any projects from being built, especially when it comes to anything extractive, that it's going to shift more because people are possibly going to realize the importance of these things now, that we can't just import everything if we really want to be truly, because we could do it more clean if we wanted to, right? We could do it cleaner than other countries that we're buying it from, if we did it ourselves. So I'm just curious if you have any opinions on the shifting mindset, which is obviously delaying all these things from being built.
Well, it's really interesting at a base level. And one thing I think is not there's a lot of flash news on this, but one thing that's not talked about enough is that there's a fundamental difference between mineral security and oil security, right? At a base level. I know I'm talking in high level terms here, but just being very clear. If you look at, let's say, for example, the materials in a solar panel versus a natural gas fired power generation station, just at a base level, right? The solar panel, once it's in service, the materials are in it for the long term, 20-year life. It's operating. It is functionally driven by technology and software to maintain it. So where it breaks down from a criticality perspective, one, there is obviously the intermittency challenge, which is being addressed with battery storage. But the supplementary challenge is really software issues and balance of systems problems, which will create the critical breakpoints, similar to lack of power or a blackout in a natural gas fired power plant scenario. The difference with fossil fuels, using this natural gas power plant as an example, is that's a continuous combustion process. So if the supply is choked off at any point in time, the continuous combustion process breaks down or the price gaps out. So the issue you have there is that the critical failure point is fundamentally different. And so if you look at the long-term security challenges of in-service electrification technology that has the materials in it versus continuous combustion processes, they're fundamentally different from a security perspective. That being said, they're going to be treated fundamentally differently on a geopolitical basis as well. So right now, being in the first inning of this, I think that people don't bifurcate them in that fashion, right? They look at, okay, we have electric vehicles, we have solar panels, that's a Chinese business, Chinese supply chain. There's a lot of anti-China rhetoric in the United States right now, and I think in Western Europe. So I think that the issue there is that building out that supply chain, we control a lot more of the cadence than we think, because once the materials are in the hardware itself, they're there for the lifetime of the product. And then there's the recycling component too on the back end, that technology is evolving every day. Whereas on the fuel side, if that's disrupted, that's disrupted. And there's immediate term impacts that have to be dealt with. So, at this juncture, I think that, the way I look at this is that growing up, dinner table conversation being, hey, the nice thing of growing oil and gas, the worst thing of growing oil and gas is that the quality, no matter what holiday you celebrate, the quality of presents is directly correlated to the price of the commodity. So it's interesting. You think about, if you can get this type of infrastructure super cycle, this type of investment, and then really all bet mining supply challenges, it's a much more economically sustainable industry, right? Whereas like the continuous combustion side of this, think about with geopolitical shock events, the amount of disruption on the traditional energy side. It's a fundamentally different business, and it's not necessarily treated as such right now. A lot of that's due to lack of education. The other side of this, speaking more broadly on supply chain security, the world is globalized to a point that only so much of this can be unwound, which I think is challenging for some people to realize. The situation in Ukraine is an acute example of some of this, I think, but it's not comparable to if there were to be some sort of conflicting issue with the Middle East or China. Russia is fundamentally a natural resource and a weapon state. And it's still highly dependent upon technology transfer and Western supply chains and capital markets to operate. This is the case with the rest of the world, But Russia is not really, apart from its natural resource reserves, a fundamental economic superpower. And the challenge that we would face if we were to get into a prolonged Cold War style conflict with China, which people are suggesting may happen. And you're seeing now as well, there's a lot of issue in Southeast Asia with countries gravitating towards China versus the United States. And I think that will continue just due to the proximity and the magnitude of the significance of China as a trading counterparty to Southeast Asian nations. I really think that this is a matter of there has to be some kind of global cooperation here. China has 1 billion people. Apart from the recent issues in the commercial real estate market there, the COVID lockdowns, they're going to be a global force for time to come. And the nature of manufacturing and the localization of supply chains there that touch the entire world, it's going to be almost impossible to unwind that, right? So I think that when you think about supply chain security, there's a difference between self-sufficiency and absolute control. And the United States versus other countries, the rhetoric since really the 1980s has been efficiency margins. So you look at what's happened is that we've unwound the United States manufacturing base globally. And what we've done is we've gone past the point of self-sufficiency to dependency. And now I think that what is articulated as resource nationalism, supply chain nationalism, is really, when you think about what's implementable and what's proper, is returning to self-sufficiency, right? Because you think that there's two sides to a geopolitical trade here that really aren't thought of properly. One, in the United States, you have someone who's in a Rust Belt state that wishes for manufacturing to return, that is been thrown a bone here by the policy, right? The other side of this, right, is that that person is going to be provided a union job, hopefully great wages, equitable opportunity in the United States, right? It sounds great, but on the other side of this, the way this rhetoric is being managed on a global basis is acutely important, because on a supplementary basis, if you think about, let's say, for example, you live in a developing country and a company like Intel has come in and built manufacturing capacity, or Coca-Cola has come in and built a facility. You've taken someone from an agrarian scenario to being able to support themselves and uplift their life. And if the rhetoric is anti that country, let's bring it back here, what those people are going to think, and this is just from my experience, just going all over the world working in the field, is that is going to be viewed as stealing, right? Is that you're taking my opportunity from me, and that leads to destabilization and nationalism in the corresponding jurisdiction. And in this case, to tie that theme off, is that in a country like China that has risen dramatically from an agrarian state to an industrial state, that is acutely on display, and it's being managed improperly. Because I think that if you look at it this way, right, it's like, we want that back, right? What is the impact to that jurisdiction, right? So all of a sudden we have this big push. Now you're going to suppress us and you're going to take it back, right? That's how this is viewed. That's going to create nationalism in that jurisdiction that opposes what the United States is trying to do.
Yeah, so essentially you're creating, there's somewhat of a kind of a margin between a zero-sum game here, where somebody has to win and somebody has to lose, and there has to be a cooperation if we want to manage it properly, and if we truly care about lifting up countries out of that agrarian state.
Well, this is I think the fundamental base of the idea of shifting manufacturing and labor-intensive businesses to the lowest common denominator of cost across the world, right? We've been seeing this for a long time, but as it relates to reshoring and climate technology, I think this is this is really on display right now. We're making serious policy pushes to bring some of this back to the United States, and it's really I think that there's a lot of discussion around how is this de-globalization trade gonna pan out, and I think we're past the point of being able to de-globalize, right? So that I think that's a really important thing. Because you look at, right now, if we were to get into some sort of major geopolitical issue, there's the 2010 rare earth quotas that China put on that created massive backlash in the international community. So I think that the point here, and I think some of the misconceptions are this is a lot more complicated and a lot more intertwined, and it's not as easy as just okay, we made some bad decisions the last 20 years, you can unwind it, right? The implications are very interconnected to everything that touches the modern world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. Well, I really like this topic in general, but I think maybe to shift a little bit to something different. Could you talk a little bit about the mining industry in general and kind of the sustainability and the impacts on the environment of that? Because I know there's a lot of people from what I've heard that just kind of look at it very negatively. So I'm just curious to understand, what does it typically look like now, and maybe where are some of the areas for improvement in that space?
Well, this is a really important topic, and I think that if you look at to take right now, just in general, the resource endowment that globally is present that we have to extract to get to net zero. It's in developing countries, in some cases frontier markets. So the governance around environmental controls, the equitable and equitable employment, and then human rights. The governance system is not in place there, and a lot of these jurisdictions, it's what's needed is capital investment and technology transfer and process knowledge transfer, not a lot of where China has done well in this, and I think where the US and Western Europe has failed is that you look at Africa or South America, the US and Western Europe come into these jurisdictions with governance, and this is they come in as a governance hawk versus coming in with money and uplifting the local economy. The Chinese have done this nefariously in some areas, but that's a fundamental issue right now as it relates to what's structurally causing some of these governance challenges, right? Is that there's a disconnect, is that the Western world looks at it as these are risky jurisdictions to invest in, and the Chinese are pouring money into it. So fundamentally, first thing, the approach of the Western world until recent months has been improperly constructed. On a supplementary basis, if you look at, there's multiple ways to implement a mining program, with the most common being open pit mine. And you have issues here. So there's air quality issues, pollution issues related to equipment, labor issues. So I think that if you look at what, in any case, hosting a mine is going to be incredibly damaging to the local jurisdiction. However, when you think about it over a long period of time, I was on a panel not long ago. There's discussion around, hey, one of the largest deposits of XYZ resource is underneath a mountain, right? It has hydroelectric resources, and you look at this way is that if we're going to meet net zero, that has to come out of the ground, right? So we need to find the most sustainable way to do this. There's really, three major issues, right? One, electrification of mining equipment to mitigate some of that pollution issue. Two, sophisticated software-enabled air quality and associated environmental control. And then the other being there's a lot of water use that gets overlooked. For example, I believe it's 65% of global lithium reserves are located near water scarce areas. So looking at, over the long term, the challenge you can run into really, it's a dirty thing. It's a part of our everyday life, right? Everything that we're communicating right now because of mining, right? And so the idea there is that some of what I always used to say, I was told when I was a kid, is that mining is a necessary evil, right, to enable the modern world. But there are certain little things that we can do with an eye towards adapting more and more and more to, once a jurisdiction hosts this, right, over a 30-year period, mine life's extended. What are the things you can do to repurpose that and not make it an eyesore that's accruing environmental liability? So I think the point here is that at a base level, this is environmentally damaging, and it's going to forever change a host jurisdiction. But the approach, air quality, environmental controls, electrifying what equipment you can, and upholding human rights in a developing country labor scenario that are the three real constituents of what a sustainable mining ecosystem looks like. And on a supplementary basis, having a plan to, one, create an impactful solution that for hosting this mine, the local jurisdiction or the country itself, let's say for Chile, for example, almost rewrote its constitution around this, receives the economic benefit, and then also receives a plan to not accrue substantial environmental liability over the long term after the decommissioning. That's what this should look like over the long term, especially as we bring on more and more and more mining capacity to support the global push to net zero. especially in jurisdictions that have little to no governance controls, or really are the beneficiaries of, to their detriment, resource curses like you've seen in South America and Africa for the last 100 years.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess, generally speaking, on this side of things, when you talk about all these things that can be done to clean it up, are there a number of solutions out there that can essentially reduce this significantly already, or are there still a lot of technologies that really need to be developed in certain niches of that space?
This is, this is what's interesting, is that a lot of these solutions are already off the bench. It's an implementation issue and an investment issue. I think that, to my original point on this, one of the challenges is that there's jurisdictional issues in a lot of the areas that have the resource endowment that create risks that push Western investors out of there, which has led China to stepping in, which until very recently did not flag these environmental control issues or governance issues as a marquee problem. This is a recent issue that's on display. So the solutions are really there. I mean, electrifying equipment. It's funny. The DOE actually did a study on this in 2003, and it was shelved. So the plans to implement some of these issues have been there for implement some of these solutions have been there for a long time. The issue is just the Western world has really pulled back from the commodity ecosystem dramatically, and China has been the leader. And until very recently, they don't have criteria around some of this. And so that's really important to note here, is that the solutions are there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, this whole idea of people, I'm assuming it was largely driven by the tech boom, right, in the US, that we kind of just focused on becoming more of a knowledge economy and wanted to go away from hardware, right? Hardware is difficult. Obviously, it's not easy as easy as software. You can spin something up quickly. And I think that it's interesting to see that we've gone away from that, obviously for various reasons, but perhaps to somewhat of a detriment to some extent, right? There should have be maybe a kind of a happy balance between the two. Any other comments you want to make on this topic? I want to move on to education next.
I think that the last thing to just think about there is that one of the issues that is very acute, going back to how China has really built this out, and how the U.S. It's interesting with fossil fuel subsidies, which aren't spoken about broadly. The state has subsidized some of what they consider the critical industries tied to this energy technology ecosystem to allow them to continue to operate when the cost curve of the associated output was not favorable to run production. That's really, really important. And then they've allowed that to be dumped into the global market, which has really been to the detriment of the state capitalism ecosystem, which is a lot different than Western capitalism. And that's been to the detriment of mineral security or supply chain security in a lot of jurisdictions in the Western world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, very good. Well, I think let's move on to education. There's two big topics I want to talk about. I think, first of all, we'd be very keen to understand, out of all these things we're talking about, it sounds like there's a lot of misconceptions and just kind of general misunderstanding, especially probably in the US was where I'm familiar with, around a lot of these things with how, I guess, the entire ecosystem works together in climate tech, and the necessity of things like mining and perhaps using carbon intensive technologies to make the energy transition happen. What are your thoughts on how can we really, on a mass scale, help people to understand kind of the realities around this, rather than just having several, some people who are interested in the space end up going to university and studying it in depth and then build a career in it. How can we help help the masses to understand this?
So there's a couple of things here. I think that, there's like on a broad line basis, I think that the understanding of the opportunity set from an employment perspective in energy transition or new energy linked careers is not well articulated. I've been a proponent of this for a long time, is that, despite being a professor at Columbia, the big thing here is there's a need for technical schools, and there's a need for someone to say, hey, I want to get a summer job. I want to do something that, test something out in the field, like to do solar installation for a summer, similar to how I did roughnecking for a summer. A lot of these jobs are acutely on display, and there's not a technical school ecosystem to get people into that. And on the other side of that too, since this is just emerging, there's not the velocity of trade organizations out there that are getting people into these jobs, right? Because we're having to manufacture a value chain tied to this. So it's, I think that one of the issues, it's early days. The second issue is that there's not a what I call a participate now training program to get people into the field. And that's the problem, right? Because if you look at a lot of the jobs that are going to be needed here, you don't need a university degree to do. You can 100% do it as the 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old to make money in the summer or something and then learn an industry. I think that the issue is that, we're such a service economy, and we've now shifted towards, we're going to do this reshoring as we discussed, and that requires a completely different style of training. And I think that it's one is technical schools, and two, it's more people. I mean, I don't know the acute numbers, but I would assume that the magnitude of liberal arts, finance, law graduates is drastically in excess of that of engineering and other STEM related programs. And there's two things when you think about STEM, right, that are important to this ecosystem. Someone like myself who goes and studies engineering, like that's totally different in a university setting than, and this is why I really think that, anyone who's interested in this should go if you're younger, go get a job doing a physical job in the field, because you'll start to understand, like, wait a second, like, this is how this is actually done, and here's the process knowledge associated with it. And that's the really important thing, is that you don't need a university degree to have process knowledge for how one of these things works. And that, I think, is, if you bifurcate STEM, I think that someone who steps into a role that's implementing something on a daily basis, like an electrician, a mechanic, something of nature, trade school oriented, that's inherently a STEM job, in my opinion, right? And there's very important process knowledge in those growing fields that, especially on the manufacturing side too, it's quite similar, that they can be fostered outside of the university setting, and we haven't set up to do that specific to this new energy ecosystem, because that's where I think the education comes from access to opportunity, right? Because if there's access to opportunity, people inherently, I mean, the consumption of information is almost a tool, skill in of itself in this day and age. But if there's access to opportunity, people will inherently educate themselves on what that is and take steps to address it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. I mean, obviously, I have a bit of a different background from a lot of people with having skipped university, so I've seen that myself. But it's also, again, same thing for me coming from rural Wisconsin. There was not a whole lot of resources, at least to my knowledge. Maybe, it was gate kept from me to some extent. But I wasn't aware of half of these things about renewables. I knew nothing about this until I ended up working in the recruitment space in renewables. So it's I think it is interesting to see that. This is something I've noticed with a lot of the people on this podcast that have come up with really cool companies, is they were people who worked in the field. Like, they really understood all the operational challenges and they knew exactly what needed to be solved. They didn't come from academia. They maybe had to partner with somebody in science, which we can get to actually in the next topic here, but they knew the problems because they worked in the field and they did the physical jobs. So shifting then into the next topic, I think it's a good segue, is you mentioned, so you obviously teach at Columbia, and you talk about for people who want to get into the climate space but aren't necessarily a technical person, aren't a deep science type of person. Could you talk about how that usually works for people and what they can do to make that work?
I think, it's really interesting, and this is, most academic institutions hate when I say this, but like, if you think about, if you really want to get a handle on, I mean, obviously, any a university thing, you go to Columbia, you get an Ivy League stamp on your resume, like that will help you, right? But at the end of the day, like, it's on you, no matter what your background is, to learn the process knowledge and implement it. And if you think about what I always tell people who say I'm interested in the climate ecosystem, it's like, okay, so if you're interested in that, you have a job, assuming that you have some type of free time on the weekend to educate yourself, look up on, everyone has access to the internet. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Go on the internet and say, impact, companies that do fuel cells, solar, pick Google climate technology ecosystem, find 10 things, and then find 25, 30 companies that are publicly traded in the US, go pull their 10Ks. They'll have an entire section of how their business works, who they compete with, cyclicality of their industry, and how the technology works in some cases. And I think it's really interesting. Like, if you look at just the SEC Edgar and the amount of companies that are required to publicly disclose what they do, there's a baby PhD you don't need any school for or any money to get. And then what you can do, what I did was pretty interesting. I left my before I started this business, I had a period of time where I was on a non-compete, and I went to go see 60, 70 businesses in this area. I just said, hey, like, I'm interested in your company, X, Y, and Z. And a lot of them are pretty receptive. Hey, we'll, take 30 minutes and show you on the shop floor. And, if you go and really take the tools that are available to you for free, there's a lot that you can do if you walk into an interview. It doesn't matter if you have a technical background or any university background whatsoever. You can educate yourself for free on the internet on how a lot of this stuff works. And there's increasingly more and more and more resources. So that to me that's the number one piece of advice, even to the students that I have that I give, is if you're interested, for example, I had a student in the summer session that I did that was interested in maritime decarbonization. And I was like, look, like, here's 25 shipping companies that are publicly traded that, like, per IMO regulation, are disclosing in 1,000 to 2,000 word increments exactly what that means, exactly how they're going to mitigate it. And then going through, they walk you through the specs of all their fleet, the business model, who they compete with, the cyclicality. So, like, you can not only get to learn the industry, but also get to know the sustainability side of it. So, I really think that, we live in such a, you have to do this to enter the workforce ecosystem. Whereas, like, in reality, the internet pedigree garnered from going to a great school is totally different than someone who I would take someone that reads 1,000 pages a day, 500 pages a day. Take a page out of Warren Buffett's. A thing he says every time is that I would take someone who takes the time, either on the weekend or during the week, to read that much and educate themselves every day as a lifelong learner, and really focus on process knowledge over someone with 3 or 4 fancy degrees, just because they're going to know what's relevant, what's practical, and that shows up, irrespective of what your background is. If you're interviewed by someone in this space who really wants to progress something forward, they're going to notice immediately when there's process knowledge present and when there's real lifelong learning in the other person that they're talking to. That's my opinion. I mean, that's probably different than what we hear from most people, but I really do think, I mean, it sounds silly, but, like, there is, an unofficial PhD available on the internet in just about everything.
No, I actually very much agree, and I've heard more than you would think on this podcast say the same thing, right? There obviously are specific areas where we're going to need a lot of engineers. I think, like, some of those things are very difficult, and it's very good to have the fundamentals from what I've heard. But even those, in my opinion, again, not being an engineer, maybe this is not a great opinion, but I think that if companies wanted to really try to find good talent, they should be sourcing for the aptitude and then train people and build it in a way. Build the companies in a way that's going to attract those people to stick around for a long time and actually reap the benefit of it. And there's also going to be a certain level of loyalty that comes along with that if the company basically helped you grow your career. And that's just my, I guess, 2 cents from a talent perspective working in the recruitment space. But I think this has been very good. Obviously, there's a lot of things we could have gone into. There's a lot more, but we're kind of at the end of time here. Any, I guess, any final thoughts you want to mention? Any things that are specifically in the climate tech space and technologies that you're really excited for, what's going to come next in maybe the next 6 months to a year, big challenges to be solved, and anything that you want to leave us with?
Well, I think that one, just, and going back to the education piece, is that, there's a need for entrepreneurs more than anything, right? And I think that, there's never been a better time speaking for the US, there's a more supportive venture, angel investing, educational ecosystem than there's ever been before to get people who have extraordinary ideas related to climate technology to a point where they can be impactful. I really do think that if you're considering entrepreneurship, this is the best time in history in this space to ever do it, and I think you should go for it, irrespective of the risk circumstances, or insert the reason not to here. There really is a lot of support there. I'd flag that as the first thing, and I think that's really important. To get to any of these climate targets, we're going to require extraordinary people to live out and really take a chance in the vision. On the other side of that, I think that we're gravitating towards a relatively mature electrification ecosystem, and I think that what I'm really looking for in the next few months, and I think it's going to be really interesting with the passage of IRA, is oil and gas companies have extraordinary technical resources in-house, and they're making money again. And they're set up to be an exceptionally impactful constituent of this climate ecosystem if they so choose to do so. So I'm really curious how these companies, I have some ideas, but are going to leverage their existing infrastructure to open up and create new markets for alternative fuels that ultimately end up decarbonizing some of these difficult to decarbonize areas.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially from an outsider's perspective. It appears as though they know that there has to be a change, right? At this point, like there might have been trying to avoid it for a while because obviously large companies aren't necessarily aren't not they're not that they're not, but they're not necessarily the most innovative sometimes. But now that they're seeing like, hey, we really need to make this push, I think there's going to be a lot of diversification of assets and investment in R&D, et cetera. That'll be interesting to see. Actually, I think it could be, in my opinion, from some of the companies I've had on here, some of the most interesting areas for growth because of the scalability across their platforms globally, right? So yeah, anyways, it's been great. Anything else you want to leave us with? Otherwise, I think we can leave it there.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening today and for tuning in. Please, of course, let us know what you thought of the show. Share any thoughts you might have or maybe insights you'd like us to dig into further in the future. And of course, as always, please share this with someone, at least just one person who might find it interesting, since our entire goal with this podcast is to spread awareness of the various different solutions and kind of discussion points within the climate tech space so everyone can be more educated. And then please, of course, consider reaching out to Nick on LinkedIn to learn more about what they're doing at Climate Commodities. And if you are joining for the first time, of course, we ask that you turn on notifications and subscribe, as we really appreciate anyone joining us on our journey. And then, of course, always a review is very helpful if you enjoy this episode in particular. And if you are interested in becoming a sponsor, you can reach out to me. We also would love to hear from anyone looking to be partners in some way and just kind of collaborate in this space. My email can be found in the description. And we will be back next time on the show with a conversation with Nicholaus Rohleder from Afresh, which is a grocery store technology company that helps grocery stores, grocers, manage their fresh produce and reduce waste by a pretty significant portion, as well as help their clients save money. So really interesting conversation on deck, and please be sure to tune into that as well. But until then, we will see you next time on CleanTechies the Podcast.